What is feudalism, you may ask? A social system that prevailed in medieval Europe from the 9th to the 15th century. The king held the most power and controlled the assets of the country with help from the lords and vassals. People of high rank gave ones with lower titles land and protection in return for participation in their army and on their land.
Feudalism in the military. Feudalism is described as a set of reciprocal legal and military obligations in Wikipedia. That's the classic definition by François-Louis Ganshoff in 1944. Maslow's hierarchy of needs points to the fact that our second level of hierarchy is safety. It's second only to food, water, and air. The safety that was falling apart as the empire fell apart. The protection was no longer there from the warring bands, the Vikings from the north, the Magyars from the east, and the Saracens from the south. We see the need for more of a local level of protection. How that occurred is that land had been portioned off as the leaders of the kings, the emperors, had become weaker and weaker. Land was portioned off to lords. But in exchange for this land, the lords then would also portion them off and require military assistance from vassals, the various underlings of the lords, and they would require military assistance whenever it was requested. The vassals found that not only could they pay homage to one lord, but that they could sell their services to multiple lords. Now, this, of course, ran into conflicts, and we come up with the term liege homage, which was the lord which the primary loyalty belonged to. And even if it meant being a bit on the treasonous side to other lords. Talk a little bit about the knights for a moment. See, the knights were the upper echelon of society. As a matter of fact, since in many cases they were determined that this was a warrior time in our history. Professor Evans points out that a strong military class was at the top of the social structure during these times. These were professionals. These were the men who practiced over and over with the jousting, with the fighting, the cavalry, their skill as military leaders. As a matter of fact, that they spent so much time doing warfare alone that they had to come up with alternatives when there were no wars to be fought. So they even designed tournaments to show how courageous they were, their skills that they would have. We often see these depicted in movies. The serfs, however, were the working class. These were unskilled. These were the needed more to help bring in the crops, and their skill at fighting was very nominal. The serfs, because they were needed to bring in the crops, in the finertimes.com, speaking of the Middle Ages and the organization of the military, if they spent much time out in the field fighting the battles, they would lose crops, they would lose livestock, they would lose income. During this time, the largest part of winning a battle was the act of surprise, catching the opponent off guard. After the mid-1300s, the tactics that were used before became obsolete.
One of the key characteristics of feudalism was the codependent relationship between the lord and the vassals. This relationship was both political and economical, as it established a very clear hierarchy and equivalized land to power in the Middle Ages. The relationship between the lords and the vassals emerged due to a lack of authority within the king. While the king himself is at the top of the pyramid, he lacked the power at the time to control the nobles, who were constantly fighting each other for territory. This is when the king had granted lands or fiefs to the lords to cease violence, appease the nobles, and retain his place of authority. This ended up, as you can see through the pyramids, being the hierarchy and the relationships that formed through these contracts. The very essence of relationship was rooted in military and protection in exchange for land. So kings would grant fiefs, or the king would grant fiefs and protection to nobles in exchange for military and loyalty. In turn, the nobles would then provide fractions of their own lands to knights or soldiers. So the knights, being of a higher social standing than the average soldier, would provide support to their lords. And you'll notice that both the nobles and the knights can be lords and vassals at the same time. So it's this very strict social order. It's what's the driving force, in feudalism. So what made these relationships so strong were the oaths of fealty. And these oaths basically swore everlasting obligations to, the Lord. Many aspects of the ceremony and the oath itself are linked to Christianity, which is the major religion at this time. Vassals were to kneel before their lords with their hands clasped in a prayer position, and they would not have any type of weapons or headgear on them. And this is to show complete submission to the noble. Then the noble would then take the vassal's hand to show acceptance. And not only is this relationship, solidified through actual benefits, but the ceremony itself is very close to worship in a way, giving both parties a spiritual dedication to one another. So these oaths are carried out in life and death. A person living during the age of feudalism never really left their rank on the pyramid. If they were born a noble, a knight, or a peasant, they would die that way. And the contractual obligations were then inherited by the next of kin. So this is what really provided the longevity of the relationship between the lords and the vassals, and why it's such a key element to feudalism. A key characteristic of feudalism is manorialism. According to Merriam-Webster, manorialism is a system of economic, social, and political organization based on the medieval manner in which a lord enjoyed a variety of rights over lands and tenants. A manor is the plot of land owned by the lord of the manor, which was split up for tenants into manor houses. The lord of the manor was in charge of the land, which gave him economic and legal power over his tenants. It can be difficult to understand the difference between feudalism and manorialism. As Stephen Tempest describes it, feudalism is focused primarily on the relationship between kings and their nobles, as well as politics and military, while manorialism focuses on the relationship between nobles and their peasants and economic and social issues. Both systems are based around the common idea of exchanging land for services. With feudalism, land would commonly be exchanged for services like serving in the king's military. With manorialism, land would often be exchanged for labor services. The photo on the slide depicts a common manor house for the lord of the manor. The lord's manor house was normally significantly larger than the other manor houses on the land. In a manor, the land can be split into 3 classes. There is demesne, which is directly controlled by the lord and used for his own personal benefit. Next, there is dependent land, which was used by peasants under the obligation that the peasant's household would supply the lord with labor services. And finally, there is free peasant land, which holds no obligations except for a rent that was fixed at the time of the lease. In the photo, you can see a classic medieval manor. As you can see, there are several manor houses as well as a church. There also is land cultivated specifically for the lord and common land used by the peasants. In conclusion, manorialism is an important characteristic of feudalism because it shows the relationships between lower members of feudal societies, whereas feudalism focuses more on the king's relationships. Manorialism gives insight on how deals were made using land and property during medieval times. As stated on manorialism's Wikipedia page, manorialism was an essential element of feudal society. It was the organizing principle of rural economy. In its simplest form, chivalry is mounted men-at-arms, knightly skill. However, chivalry was also the fundamental qualities of the ideal knight, the system, spirit, or customs of medieval knighthood, corresponding to Merriam-Webster's dictionary's definition. Knights were considered low-ranking nobles that were trained to be mounted warriors. Though most noblemen were trained in the art of warfare, for knights, according to the age of chivalry, training began when the sons of nobles were at an early age, which included studying the code of chivalry, and at the age of 7, the young boys would travel to the castle of a lord. They started off as a page and would wait on their host, along with practice in combat techniques. When they would reach about the age of 14, the boys would then achieve the status of squire and would attend as a servant to a knight. Around the age of 21, the squires would then be appointed as full-fledged knights. On the other hand, commoners were simply foot soldiers. Knights owed military service to their lords in return for money and fief by the vassals. In peacetime, they acted as administrators and watched over the peasants. A document that depicts the Code of Chivalry is the 10 Commandments of Chivalry, created in 1800 by Leon Gautier. Even though the commandments were passed long after knights ceased to exist, Gautier still provides an idea of how knights were expected to carry themselves and act in the Middle Ages. The 10 Commandments summarized are: you shall love the church and your own country, defend the church and the weak, do not retreat from the enemy and show no mercy to them, fulfill your duties to the fullest and never tell a lie. You must always be generous and embody the opposition of evil. A work of medieval literature that provides examples of exceptional chivalry is the Song of Roland, written by an anonymous source. This is an epic about the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass, which happened during Charlemagne's rule. Throughout the epic, it is evident that knights have a code of honor to follow. These quotes from the epic support the commandments written by Gautier just mentioned. Turpin the Archbishop rides through the field of battle. Never has mass been sung by a tonsured priest who performed such feats of valor as he. He said to the heathen, "May God send thee every ill. Thou hast killed one whom I regret in my heart." Turpin is seen as a prime example of representing faith, bravery, and loyalty to his king. Turpin also exclaims to his fellow warriors, "Barons, my lord, Charlemagne left us in this place. We know our duty, to die like good men for our king, fight to defend the holy Christian faith." He is devoted to the Christian church and is willing to fight to the death in the name of his king and oath he took. And may God grant it. For one's lord, one ought to suffer hardship and endure both great heat and cold, and lose one's skin and hair. Roland, the main character of the story, explains to his men that they must be ready to go into battle for their sovereign, as giving their all deems them dedicated knights in the feudal system. Throughout the medieval era, the feudal system flourished between the 9th through 15th centuries. The structure of lords granting land to lower-class patrons to work on and protect allowed them, as a whole, to distinguish between each level of the feudal pyramid mentioned prior. The military, lord and vassal relationship, manorialism, and chivalry are just a few characteristics of feudalism that shaped the way societies functioned during the time period. All these components play a key role for historians, along with students, in understanding the essence of the complicated system that lasted for so long.